Within 3 hours of the incident, the security footage had been reviewed, analyzed, and cleared for distribution throughout the Academy network. The video showed everything exactly as the witnesses had described. Commander Veltar striking, Jake without provocation, Jake restraining the instructor with minimal force, and then releasing him unharmed while attempting to return to normal classroom discussion. What made the footage remarkable was not just what happened, but what did not happen. Jake never retaliated with violence, never used more force than necessary to protect himself, and never lost control despite being physically assaulted by a superior officer. The restraint he showed was as impressive as the strength he demonstrated. By dinner time, copies of the video were circulating through unofficial channels across the Galactic Communication Network. Students shared it with friends on other stations, instructors sent it to colleagues at different academies, and military personnel forwarded it to units stationed throughout known space. The video became viral not because a human had defeated an alien, but because of what happened after the confrontation ended. Most species expected Deathworlders to be savage and uncontrolled, but Jake's behavior challenged every stereotype about human nature and capabilities. Jake tried to eat his dinner in peace, but found himself the center of attention wherever he went. Students from dozens of species approached his table to ask questions, offer congratulations, or simply stare at him as if he had grown extra limbs overnight. A group of Zephyrian cadets approached him with obvious nervousness, their compound eyes tracking his movements with the wariness that prey animals showed around predators. Their spokesperson, a young female named Zekthi, clicked and whistled for several seconds before her translator converted the sounds into Galactic Standard Language. Cadet Morrison, we wish to apologize for our instructor's behavior and express our admiration for your restraint, she said, her translated voice carrying none of the emotional undertones that gave meaning to Zephyrian communication. Jake looked up from his gray-paced dinner and smiled, wincing slightly as the expression pulled at his swollen lip. Thank you, but no apology is necessary. Commander Veltar was doing what he thought was right according to his cultural understanding. We all have things to learn about working together. Sup? Zephyrian students exchanged rapid clicks and whistles before Zekthi spoke again. We have never seen such control demonstrated by any species. Our people value strength, but we are beginning to understand that your kind of strength is different from what we expected. Similar conversations happened throughout the evening as word of the incident spread and students processed what they had witnessed. Jake found himself explaining human culture, combat training, and the concept of proportional response to beings who had never encountered such ideas before. The most surprising visitor came late in the evening when Jake heard a soft knock on his dormitory door. He opened it to find Commander Veltar standing in the corridor, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever appeared in the classroom. Cadet Morrison, may I speak with you privately? The Zephyrian instructor asked, his translator struggling. With the humble tone of his natural speech, Jake invited him into the small quarters he shared with his Altarian roommate, who discreetly withdrew to give them privacy for their conversation. Commander Veltar looked around the spartanly furnished room with its regulation furniture and personal items that showed hints of Jake's Colorado background. I came to apologize, Commander Veltar said without preamble. Not just for striking you, but for everything that led to that moment. I allowed my prejudices and fear to override my judgment as both an instructor and an officer. Jake gestured for the commander to sit on the small chair near the desk. Sir, you were acting according to your cultural understanding of proper behavior. I do not hold that against you. But I should have known better, Commander Veltar replied. His mandibles clicking with what Jake had learned was a sign of distress in his species. "I have access to all the same reports and studies that other instructors do. I knew about human capabilities and restraint, but I chose to focus only on the parts that confirmed my existing beliefs." The commander was quiet for a moment, his compound eyes reflecting the soft light from Jake's reading lamp. "When you caught my strike, when you held my arms as easily as I might hold a child, I realized that every human in my classes had been showing me the same restraint you demonstrated. Today, you could have hurt me at any time, but you chose not to." Jake nodded slowly. "That is what civilization means to us. Having the power to hurt someone but choosing not to use it unless absolutely necessary. I have requested a transfer to Human Cultural Studies," Commander Veltar said quietly. "I want to understand your species better, not just your military capabilities but your philosophy and values. Perhaps I can help other instructors avoid making the same mistakes I made." The conversation continued for another hour as Jake patiently answered questions about human history, culture, and the experiences that shaped their approach to conflict and cooperation. Commander Veltar listened with the intensity of someone trying to rebuild his understanding of the universe from the ground up. Over the following days, the incident continued to generate discussion throughout the Academy and beyond. Military analysts studied the footage to better understand human capabilities, xenobiologists requested data about Deathworlder evolution, and philosophers debated the implications of a species that combined lethal potential with moral restraint. Jake returned to his normal routine of classes, training, and study, but found that his relationships with non-human students had fundamentally changed. Where once there had been fear or condescension, now there was a mixture of respect and curiosity. Students who had never spoken to him before began asking for his opinions on tactical problems and strategic questions. The most significant change came in Advanced Combat Theory class, which resumed a week later with Commander Veltar back as instructor. The Zephyrian's teaching style had undergone a complete transformation as he began incorporating human tactical innovations and encouraging diverse perspectives from all species. "Today we will examine the Battle of Proxima Colony, Commander," Veltar announced to the class, with particular attention to how mixed-species units achieved victory through adaptive tactics rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. Jake found himself being asked to contribute regularly to class discussions, not as a token Deathworlder, but as a valued member of the academic community whose insights were respected and considered. Other human students began speaking up more, frequently as well, sharing their perspectives without fear of ridicule or dismissal. The incident became known throughout the Academy as the 10-minute lesson, a reminder that true strength lay not in the ability to inflict damage, but in the wisdom to know when restraint was the better choice. It was taught in ethics classes alongside tactical training, used as an example of how different species could learn from conflict rather than be divided by it. 3 months later, Jake received a package with no return address. Inside was a small, crystal sculpture that rang like a bell when touched, along with a note written in both Zephyrian script and Galactic Standard text. The inscription read, "Strength is nothing without wisdom. Wisdom is nothing without courage." The sculpture came from Commander Veltar, who had indeed transferred to Human Cultural Studies and was already being recognized as one of the leading experts on Deathworlder psychology and human military philosophy. His papers on the subject were required reading at military academies throughout the galaxy. Jake graduated top of his class 2 years later and was commissioned as an officer in the United Planets Defense Force. His first assignment was as a tactical advisor to a mixed-species peacekeeping unit, where his ability to understand and coordinate different species' capabilities made him invaluable in complex diplomatic and military situations. Captain Jake Morrison returned to the Academy 5 years after the incident to teach the same advanced combat theory class where everything had started. The classroom looked exactly the same, with its adjustable seating and environmental controls designed to accommodate the needs of dozens of different species. On his desk sat the crystal sculpture from Commander Veltar, now retired but still contributing to interspecies understanding through his research and writing. The inscription had become Jake's personal motto and the foundation of his teaching philosophy. As he looked out at the diverse faces of his new students, representing dozens of worlds and evolutionary paths, Jake began his first lesson with a simple question that would have made his old instructor proud. Who can tell me why understanding your teammates is more important than understanding your enemies? A young Zephyrian cadet raised her hand eagerly, and Jake smiled as he recognized the daughter of Zekathy, the student who had approached him years ago to apologize for her instructor's behavior. The galaxy was changing. One student and one lesson at a time, and Jake was proud to be part of that transformation. The lesson continued with animated discussion from students of all species, their voices blending together in the complex harmony of a truly. Jake released Commander Veltar's arms and took a deliberate step backward, his movement controlled and precise despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The sudden absence of restraint caught the Zephyrian instructor off guard, his body still straining against resistance that was no longer there. Commander Veltar stumbled backward, his 6 legs tangling as he tried to regain his balance. The careful coordination that made his species such graceful predators failed him completely as panic and disorientation overwhelmed his nervous system. He fell hard, hitting the metal floor with a resounding crash that shook the entire classroom. The sound of the impact seemed to break whatever spell had held the other students frozen in their seats. The room erupted into chaos as dozens of voices began speaking at once in languages from across the galaxy. Some cadets were calling for security through their personal communicators, others were recording everything with their data pads, and more than a few were simply staring in shocked silence at the scene before them. Jake calmly returned to his seat, moving with the same measured pace he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. He pulled a tissue from his pocket and dabbed at his split lip with careful attention, as if grooming himself was the most important task in the universe at that moment. Commander Veltar remained on the floor, not because he was physically injured, but because his pride and worldview had been so thoroughly shattered that he could not bring himself to stand. Everything he thought he knew about species hierarchy, about the natural order of the galaxy, about the proper relationship between civilized beings and primitive Deathworlders, had been destroyed in the span of less than a minute. Lisa Chen was staring at Jake with wide eyes, her mouth slightly open as she processed what she had just witnessed. She had known Jake for 2 years, had trained with him in combat classes, had seen him handle himself in difficult situations, but she had never seen him demonstrate the full extent of human capabilities in such a direct and undeniable way. The 2 other human students in the classroom were having similar reactions, a mixture of pride and concern as they realized that their friend had just provided every alien in the room with a very clear demonstration of why their species was both respected and feared throughout the galaxy. "Anyone else have thoughts on the tactical formation discussion?" Jake asked, looking around the room with the same polite attention he had shown at the beginning of class. The question was so perfectly normal, so completely at odds with what had just happened that several students actually laughed nervously. Jake was acting as if physically restraining their instructor and dropping him to the floor was just a minor interruption in the academic discussion rather than a life-changing demonstration of interspecies power dynamics. An Altarian cadet named Kethara slowly raised her hand, her blue skin shimmering with the nervous energy that her species displayed when under stress. Perhaps we could discuss integration patterns that take advantage of natural species abilities rather than forcing standardized formations? Jake nodded approvingly, as if this was exactly the kind of thoughtful question he had been hoping to hear. That is an excellent point. What specific advantages do you think each species brings to a mixed unit? Lisa Chen found her voice and joined the discussion, her training in military theory helping her overcome the shock of what she had just witnessed. Altarian telepathic coordination could link different species groups even when standard communication is compromised by enemy jamming. Good thinking, Jake replied, dabbing at his lip again as a small amount of blood continued to seep from the cut. What about Zephyrian mobility advantages? How could we use their speed and agility in a more flexible formation? Commander Veltar made a sound that might have been a whimper or might have been an attempt at speech. He was still on the floor, his compound eyes staring at the ceiling as if he could find answers there for questions he did not know how to ask. The classroom door burst open as Academy security arrived, their heavy boots echoing against the metal floor as they rushed into the room with weapons drawn and ready. The security team was mixed species, with both human and alien officers working together to handle potential threats to station safety. "What is the situation here?" demanded Security Chief Martinez, a human woman whose voice carried the authority of someone who had dealt with every possible type of crisis that could occur when dozens of species tried to live and work together in a confined space. The students all began talking at once, each trying to explain what had happened from their own perspective and in their own language. The result was a cacophony of sound that made it impossible to understand anything except that something significant had occurred. "One at a time," Chief Martinez ordered, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Cadet Morrison, you appear to be injured. What happened?" Jake touched his lip gingerly and looked down at Commander Veltar, who was still lying on the floor in what appeared to be a state of shock. "There was a disagreement about tactical doctrine, Chief. Commander Veltar struck me to demonstrate proper military discipline. I responded by restraining him to prevent further escalation. The explanation was delivered in the same calm, factual tone that Jake had used throughout the entire confrontation. Chief Martinez looked from Jake to the fallen instructor and back again, her experienced eye taking in the details of the scene and drawing conclusions about what had actually transpired. "Commander Veltar, are you injured?" she asked, kneeling beside the Zephyrian instructor and checking for obvious signs of damage. "Injured." Commander Veltar's voice came out as a strangled whistle. "No, not injured. Humiliated. Defeated. Everything I thought I knew about the universe has been proven wrong." Chief Martinez helped the commander to his feet, though he seemed unsteady and disoriented despite having no apparent physical injuries. "Perhaps you should report to medical for evaluation, Commander. Sometimes shock can mask more serious problems." "Shock," Commander Veltar repeated, as if the word held special significance. "Yes, I suppose that is what this is. I have been shocked into understanding something that I should have learned long ago." He looked across the room at Jake, who was still sitting calmly at his desk as if nothing unusual had happened. "Cadet Morrison, I owe you an apology. I allowed my prejudices and assumptions to override my judgment as an instructor and as an officer. Jake stood up and came to attention, showing the same military courtesy he had displayed throughout the entire incident. No apology necessary, sir. We all have things to learn about working with different species. Chief Martinez was making notes on her data pad as she recorded the incident for her official report. I will need to review the classroom security footage, but based on initial witness statements, it appears that Cadet Morrison acted in self-defense and showed appropriate restraint. The security chief looked around the room at the still stunned students. I suggest that everyone take some time to process what happened here today. Classes are suspended for the remainder of the afternoon while we complete our investigation. As the students began filing out of the classroom, many of them cast curious glances back at Jake, who was packing his data pad and notes as if this had been just another normal day of classes. Word of the incident would spread throughout the academy within hours, carried by personal messages, social networks, and the kind of informal communication that moved faster than official reports. Lisa Chen waited for Jake by the door, still, trying to understand what she had witnessed. "Are you okay?" she asked as they walked together toward the dormitory section of the station. Jake shrugged, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated the growing bruise on his face. "I am fine. My pride is a little bruised along with my cheek, but nothing serious." "Jake," Lisa said seriously, "what you did in there was incredible. I had no idea humans were capable of that level of physical control." "Most of us are not," Jake replied honestly. "I grew up in the mountains, hunting and hiking and dealing with dangerous wildlife. My dad was a combat veteran who taught me that. Real strength is not about how much damage you can do, but about how much restraint you can show when you have the power to hurt someone." They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts about the implications of what had occurred. Finally, Lisa spoke again. "Do you think this will change how the other species see humans?" Jake considered the question carefully before answering. "I hope it helps them understand that we are not savages or primitives. We are survivors who learn to be dangerous when necessary, but also learn to be civilized when possible. Maybe that is what the galaxy needs to remember." About Deathworlders. The strike came without further warning, Commander Veltar's primary manipulator arm whipping forward with the speed and precision that made Zephyrians feared as warriors across the galaxy. The blow caught Jake across the left side of his face, with enough force to shatter the skull of most species, the sound echoing through the classroom like a gunshot in an empty cathedral. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the entire room held its breath. Students from a dozen different species watched with wide eyes and open mouths as they waited to see the human cadet collapse to the floor like any reasonable being would after such a devastating impact. Instead, Jake absorbed the blow with his head snapping to the side, his feet remaining planted firmly on the ground as if they had grown roots into the metal decking. A thin line of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth where his teeth had cut into his lip, but otherwise he showed no sign that he had just been struck by one of the most powerful species in known space. Commander Veltar's compound eyes widened, with something that might have been surprise, though it was difficult to read emotion in an alien face. In Zephyrian culture, physical discipline was an accepted method of maintaining order and respect, and such a strike should have been both punishment and demonstration of superiority rolled into one decisive action. The fact that Jake was still standing, still conscious, and still maintaining eye contact was incomprehensible to the Zephyrian instructor. His species had evolved as apex predators on their homeworld, and their physical capabilities were legendary throughout the galaxy. The idea that a member of any other species could simply absorb such punishment without falling was outside his understanding of how the universe worked. Slowly, deliberately, Jake turned his head back to face Commander Veltar, never breaking eye contact despite the pain radiating through his skull and jaw. The movement was controlled and precise, showing no sign of the disorientation that should have accompanied such a blow. Jake wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand, the gesture casual and almost dismissive. The red stain on his skin seemed to glow under the classroom lights, a stark reminder of what had just occurred. "Is that all, sir?" Jake asked, his voice steady and clear despite the swelling that was already beginning to affect the left side of his face. The question hung in the air like a challenge, though Jake had asked it in the same respectful tone he had been using throughout the conversation. Around the classroom, students began to murmur in their various languages as they processed what they had just witnessed. The Altarian cadets were communicating through rapid telepathic exchanges that created visible ripples in the air around their heads. The Vortan students rang like bells as their crystalline bodies vibrated with excitement or fear. Even the normally stoic Rigelian cadets were showing signs of agitation, their scaled skin shifting colors in patterns that Jake had learned indicated extreme interest or concern. Commander Veltar stared at Jake with all the compound segments of his eyes, as if he could make sense of the situation through sheer intensity of observation. In his species' social structure, the demonstration of physical dominance should have settled the matter completely. The subordinate should have acknowledged defeat, accepted correction, and returned to proper behavior. Instead, the human was standing there as if nothing significant had happened, asking if there was more to come with what sounded disturbingly like genuine curiosity rather than fear or submission. "Perhaps the Deathworlder needs a more thorough lesson," Commander Veltar clicked, his mandibles spreading wide in what Jake recognized as an aggressive display. The instructor raised his manipulator arm again, this time positioning himself for a strike with his full body weight behind it. Jake watched the preparation with the calm attention of someone observing an interesting but distant phenomenon. Part of his mind was cataloging the Zephyrian stance, balance, and striking pattern for future reference, while another part was calculating angles and responses with the automatic precision that came from years of combat training. "I would not recommend that, sir," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby cadets instinctively lean away from their desks. The warning was delivered in the same respectful tone that Jake had maintained throughout the confrontation. But there was something underneath the words that spoke to the deepest survival instincts of every predator species in the room. It was the sound that prey animals made just before they revealed that they were not actually prey at all. Commander Veltar hesitated for a fraction of a second, some primitive part of his brain recognizing the change in Jake's tone and posture. But his pride and cultural conditioning overrode his instincts, and he committed to the attack with all the speed and power that his species could generate. The second strike was faster and more powerful than the first, driven by embarrassment, and the need to reassert dominance in front of his students. Commander Veltar put his entire body behind the blow, his 6 legs bracing against the floor as his manipulator arm cut through the air with enough force to punch through most types of armor. Jake's hand moved with the liquid speed that had made humans legendary in combat sports across the galaxy, intercepting Commander Veltar's striking limb mid-swing with casual precision. The sound of the catch was like thunder, the impact of unstoppable force meeting immovable object reverberating through the metal structure of the classroom. Commander Veltar's compound eyes went wide with shock as he realized that his arm was completely immobilized in the human's grip. He tried to pull back, straining with all the considerable strength in his powerful frame, but Jake's fingers were locked around his manipulator like bands of steel. The classroom erupted in shocked exclamations and nervous chatter as students witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of physics and biology. They had all heard stories about human capabilities, whispered tales from the combat instructors and veterans who had served alongside Deathworlders in actual combat situations. But hearing stories was different from seeing the reality demonstrated in front of them. Jake was not particularly large for a human, certainly not the biggest in his class, yet he had just stopped a full-power strike from one of the most physically capable species in the galaxy as easily as someone might catch a thrown ball. "Commander," Jake said, his voice still calm but now carrying an unmistakable undertone of controlled danger, "I have been hit harder by my little sister during sparring practice." The statement was delivered as a simple fact rather than a boast, but its implications sent a chill through the watching students. If this level of force was considered minor by human standards, what were the upper limits of their capabilities? What kind of world produced beings who could casually absorb punishment, that would hospitalize most known species? Jake increased the pressure in his grip incrementally, just enough for Commander Veltar to feel the gradual compression of his manipulator arm. The Zephyrian instructor tried again to pull away, using both his body weight and leverage, but found himself unable to break free from the human's iron grasp. "You see, sir," Jake continued in the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather, "humans do not just survive on a death world. We thrive on it. We hunt creatures that could eat most of your species for breakfast. We have been fighting wars since before we could write, and we have gotten very, very good at it." Commander Veltar attempted to strike with his secondary manipulator arm, desperate to regain some measure of control over the situation. Jake caught that arm as well, now holding both of the Zephyrian's primary striking limbs in an unbreakable grip that left the instructor completely helpless. The watching students stared in fascination and growing horror as they witnessed something they had only heard about in whispered stories and military legends. This was not just superior strength or reflexes. This was a demonstration of the fundamental difference between species that had evolved in safety and comfort versus those that had been forged in the crucible of a world that actively tried to kill them every day. "The thing about us Deathworlders," Jake said, taking a small step forward that forced Commander Veltar to step back despite his six-legged stability, "is that we do not just endure pain, we use it. That strike you threw triggered every combat. Reflex evolution gave us. Right now, my body is flooded with enough adrenaline to let me bench press a hover car." Commander Veltar's mandibles were clicking rapidly in distress, the sound like castanets in the hands of a panicking musician. He tried to call for help, but only a strangled whistle emerged from his breathing apparatus as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his understanding. "But here is what makes humans really special," Jake continued, his grip tightening until the Zephyrian's exoskeleton began to creak audibly under the pressure. "We know when to stop." Commander Veltar's compound eyes focused on Jake with the intensity of a targeting system locking onto a threat. The silence in the classroom stretched for several seconds before the Zephyrian instructor acknowledged the raised hand with a sharp click of his mandibles. "Yes. Cadet Morrison, do you have a question about the defensive formation protocol?" The translator made his voice sound flat and emotionless, but Jake could hear the underlying irritation in the original clicks and whistles. Jake stood up slowly, aware that every student in the room was now watching him. He had learned early, in his time at the academy, that humans drew attention simply by existing, and speaking up in class only magnified that attention. "Sir, I was wondering about the flexibility of the formation when facing unconventional attack patterns." The commander's head tilted slightly, a gesture that Jake had learned indicated either confusion or annoyance in Zephyrian body language. "Unconventional attack patterns. The formation I have presented follows standard galactic military doctrine. It has been tested and proven effective across multiple campaigns." "Yes, sir. But what if the enemy uses guerrilla tactics or asymmetric warfare?" Jake continued, keeping his voice respectful but confident. "In human military history, we found that rigid formations could be vulnerable to enemies who refuse to fight conventionally." A low murmur rippled through the classroom as students began whispering to each other in their various languages. Jake caught fragments of conversation from the universal translators. Typical human obsession with violence. Always thinking about fighting. Deathworlders and their primitive strategies. Commander Veltar's primary manipulator arms crossed over his thorax, a clear sign of displeasure. "Cadet Morrison, your species' obsession with violence and chaos is not applicable to civilized warfare. Perhaps if humans spent less time fighting each other and more time learning proper military science, you would understand why your suggestion is crude and ineffective." Jake felt his jaw muscles tighten, but he maintained his composure. He had dealt with this attitude for 2 years. The assumption that humans were naturally violent savages who had stumbled into space travel through luck rather than intelligence. "Sir, with respect, I was not suggesting chaos. I was thinking about adaptability. For example, in the Battle of Proxima Colony, the mixed species units that performed best were those that leveraged the natural abilities of each species rather than forcing them into standardized roles." The mention of Proxima Colony caused another stir in the classroom. It had been one of the first major victories for the United Planets Defense Force, and human tactical innovation had played a significant role in the success. Jake knew his military history, and he knew that the standard textbook version taught in most galactic academies downplayed the human contributions to focus on technological superiority and proper protocol adherence. Commander Veltar's compound. Eyes seemed to flash with anger, though Jake was not sure if the lighting effect was real or his imagination. "Enough!" The translated word came out as a sharp whistle that made several students flinch. "You will not lecture me on military history, Deathworlder. Your kind may be useful as shock troops, but strategic thinking requires evolved intellect." The insult hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jake heard Lisa intake sharply from her seat nearby, and several other human students shifted uncomfortably. The term Deathworlder was not inherently offensive, but the way Commander Veltar used it made it clear that he considered it synonymous with primitive and unintelligent. Jake stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet classroom. Even the normally chattering Altarian students had gone silent, their telepathic communications creating an uncomfortable pressure that Jake could feel at the edges of his consciousness. "Sir, I was simply offering tactical input as requested." "In the assignment brief," Jake said, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. "The brief specifically asked for analysis of formation weaknesses and potential improvements." Commander Veltar began walking toward Jake's desk, his 6 legs clicking against the metal floor in a rhythm that sounded distinctly threatening. As he approached, Jake could see the details of his alien physiology more clearly. The way his compound eyes tracked multiple points simultaneously, the sharp edges of his mandibles, the powerful muscles in his manipulator arms that could easily crush most organic materials. At full height, Commander Veltar towered over most species in the room, but Jake was tall for a human, and he did not step back or lower his gaze as the instructor approached. The size difference was intimidating, but Jake had grown up in the Rocky Mountains where he had faced down bears and mountain lions. Fear was a luxury he had learned to control. Your input is neither requested nor valued. Primitive, Commander, Veltar said, his translated voice dropping to a lower pitch that made the words sound even more menacing. Perhaps a practical demonstration of proper military bearing is required. Jake could feel the tension ratcheting up with each exchange. Around the classroom, students were beginning to shift in their seats, some leaning forward with anticipation, others leaning back as if trying to distance themselves from whatever was about to happen. The Zephyrian students seemed particularly agitated, their compound eyes tracking between Jake and their instructor with rapid movements. Lisa Chen caught Jake's eye from her seat and gave him a subtle shake of her head, a warning to back down before the situation escalated further. Jake appreciated her concern, but he also knew that backing down now would only confirm every stereotype about human unpredictability and lack of discipline. "I am demonstrating proper military bearing, sir," Jake replied, his voice steady, but with an edge that had not been there before. "I am standing at attention, addressing a superior officer with respect, and offering tactical analysis as requested, in the assignment parameters." Commander Veltar moved closer, now standing directly in front of Jake's desk. The alien's breathing apparatus made a sound like steam escaping from a pressure valve, and Jake could smell the sharp, chemical scent that Zephyrians emitted when they were agitated or preparing for confrontation. "Respect?" Commander Veltar's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sound that Jake had learned indicated extreme displeasure. "You dare to speak of respect while questioning my expertise and promoting your species' barbaric approach to warfare?" The classroom had become completely silent except for the low hum of the station's life support systems and the occasional nervous shuffle from one of the students. Jake could feel dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see how he would respond to the increasingly hostile confrontation. Jake took a slow breath, calling on the meditation techniques he had learned from his Altarian roommate during his first year. The blue-skinned telepaths were masters of emotional control, and they had taught him methods for staying calm under pressure that had served him well in both academic and combat situations. "Sir, I am not questioning your expertise," Jake said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "I am offering a different perspective based on my species' military experience. The assignment brief encouraged diverse viewpoints and creative problem-solving approaches." Commander Veltar's head tilted at an angle that suggested he was considering Jake's words, but his body language remained aggressive and confrontational. The instructor's primary manipulator arms flexed slightly, and Jake noticed that several of the other Zephyrian students had begun making low clicking sounds that he recognized as expressions of anticipation or excitement. "Your perspective is that of a savage from a Deathworld," Commander Veltar said, his voice rising in pitch until the translator struggled to maintain its mechanical tone. "Your species has no concept of proper military discipline or civilized warfare. You bring nothing to this discussion except primitive violence and chaos." Jake felt something snap inside his chest. Not anger exactly, but a cold clarity that he recognized from his training sessions with human combat instructors back on Earth. It was the moment when his body began preparing for a fight, even though his mind was still focused on finding a peaceful resolution to the confrontation. "Commander," Jake said, his voice dropping to a quieter level that somehow carried more authority than shouting would have. "I think we should return to the lesson. The other students are here to learn military tactics, not to watch personal disagreements." The suggestion was reasonable and diplomatic, but Jake could see in Commander Veltar's compound eyes that reason and diplomacy were no longer options. The Zephyrian instructor had committed himself to a path of confrontation, and his species' rigid social hierarchy would not allow him to back down without losing face in front of his students. Commander Veltar's manipulator arm rose slowly, and Jake realized with crystalline clarity that the situation was about to escalate beyond words. The morning alarm echoed through the metal corridors of Kepler 7 station, waking thousands of cadets from dozens of different worlds. Jake Morrison rolled out of his narrow bunk and stretched his arms above his head, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders from yesterday's combat training. His roommate was already gone, probably at morning meditation like most Altarians did before breakfast. Jake looked out the small window of his quarters and saw the stars spinning slowly past, as the massive station rotated to create artificial gravity. 3 years ago, he never would have imagined he would be here, floating in space, learning to fight alongside aliens from across the galaxy. Back home in Colorado, the biggest worry was whether it would snow enough for good skiing. Now he was training to defend planets he had never heard of against threats that most humans could not even imagine. The cafeteria buzzed with the sounds of 100 different languages and communication methods. Jake grabbed a tray and loaded it with what the food dispensers called human nutrition blend, which tasted like chicken and rice but looked like gray paste. He had stopped complaining about the food after his first month when he realized that most other species thought it smelled delicious. He found his usual table near the back corner where the lighting was dimmer. Most aliens preferred brighter environments than humans, so this spot was usually empty. Jake was halfway through his breakfast when Lisa Chen sat down across from him. She was one of only 12 humans in his year, and one of the few who had become a real friend. "Ready for Veltar's class today?" Lisa asked, spooning some blue gel into her mouth. She had adapted to alien food better than most humans, and actually seemed to enjoy the strange textures and flavors. Jake grimaced and swallowed another bite of the gray paste. As ready as anyone can be for 2 hours of being told how primitive and violent humans are. He kept his voice low because several Zephyrian cadets were sitting at nearby tables, their compound eyes constantly scanning the room for potential threats or interesting conversations. "Maybe he will be in a better mood today," Lisa said, though her tone suggested she did not really believe it. Commander Veltar had made his opinion of humans very clear from the first day of advanced combat theory. He seemed to think that humans were lucky accidents who had stumbled into space travel without developing proper civilization first. Jake finished his breakfast and checked the time display on his wrist communicator. "We should get going. You know how he gets when humans are late." They cleared their trays and walked through the corridors toward the academic section of the station. The hallways were filled with cadets from every corner of the galaxy. Tall Altarians glided past with their blue skin shimmering under the lights, their movements so graceful they seemed to be dancing rather than walking. Groups of Zephyrians clicked and whistled to each other in their rapid-fire language, their insect-like bodies moving in perfect coordination. Crystal-based vortans rang like wind chimes as they walked, their bodies catching and reflecting the light in beautiful patterns. Jake had grown used to the stares and whispers that followed him and the other humans through the halls. Most species were fascinated by the idea of Deathworlders, beings who had evolved on a planet so dangerous that simply surviving to adulthood was considered an achievement. Earth was classified as a Class-12 death world, a place where the weather could kill you, the animals could kill you, the plants could kill you, and even the air could kill you if you were not careful. The classification had given humans a reputation that preceded them wherever they went in galactic society. Some species feared them, believing that anyone from such a hostile environment must be naturally violent and unpredictable. Others respected them, recognizing that surviving on Earth required intelligence, adaptability, and courage. A few, like Commander Veltar, seemed to resent them for earning their place in the galaxy through hardship rather than technological advancement. Jake and Lisa entered the classroom just as the second bell chimed. The room was designed to accommodate the different physical needs of various species, with adjustable seating, multiple lighting zones, and atmosphere controls that could create different environmental conditions in different sections. Jake took his usual seat in the human section, where the gravity was set to Earth normal, and the air composition matched what his lungs expected. Commander Veltar entered the room with the clicking sound that Zephyrians made when they walked on hard surfaces. He was taller than most members of his species, standing nearly 8 feet high on his 6 legs. His compound eyes could track multiple targets at once, and his translator collar converted his whistles and clicks into galactic standard language for the benefit of species who could not understand Zephyrian communication naturally. Today, we will continue our study of defensive formations in multi-species combat units, the commander announced, his translated voice carrying the cold, mechanical tone that made all translator output sound emotionless. As I explained in our previous session, proper military doctrine requires discipline, coordination, and adherence to established protocols. Jake opened his data pad and prepared to take notes, though he suspected that most of the lesson would be a repeat of information he had already learned in basic tactics classes. Commander Veltar had a habit of explaining things as if his students were hearing them for the first time, especially when humans were involved in the discussion. The commander activated the holographic display in the center of the room, showing a 3-dimensional battlefield with various unit positions marked in different colors. The key to successful defensive operations is maintaining proper spacing and communication between units. Each species must remain in their assigned positions and follow orders precisely. Jake watched the display and frowned slightly. The formation looked rigid and inflexible, with each species grouped together in separate sections rather than integrated throughout the defensive line. In human military history, such segregated formations had proven vulnerable to enemy tactics that could exploit the gaps between different unit types. The lesson continued with Commander Veltar explaining how each species should respond to different types of attacks. Altarians would use their telepathic abilities to coordinate communication, Zephyrians would provide rapid response with their speed and agility, Vortans would create barriers with their crystalline structures, and humans would serve as heavy assault troops to break enemy formations. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the commander described the human role in purely aggressive terms, as if they were useful only for charging directly at the enemy and absorbing damage. It was a common misconception about Deathworlders, the idea that their main value lay in their ability to endure punishment rather than their tactical thinking or adaptability. As the lesson progressed, Jake noticed that several of his non-human classmates were glancing in his direction whenever Commander Veltar made comments about human capabilities or limitations. Some looked curious, others seemed amused, and a few appeared uncomfortable with the obvious bias in their instructor's presentation. Jake tried to focus on taking notes and learning whatever useful information he could extract from the lesson, but he found himself growing increasingly frustrated with the one-dimensional view of human military contributions. He had studied enough galactic military history to know that human units had distinguished themselves not just through courage and endurance, but through innovation, flexibility, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The classroom fell silent as Commander Veltar finished explaining the basic defensive formation and turned his attention to the students. "Are there any questions about the proper implementation of these tactics?" he asked, his compound eyes scanning the room with the mechanical precision of a security camera. Jake felt the familiar tension that came before he decided to speak up in class. He knew that challenging the commander's presentation would likely result in another lecture about human primitiveness. But he also knew that staying silent would mean missing an opportunity to contribute something valuable to the discussion. He raised his hand slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of alien eyes turning toward him as he prepared to offer his perspective on the tactical situation.